Hi there, welcome back to Dialogue. It's been 17 years since China joined the World Trade Organization, a milestone for the Chinese economy. Accession to the WTO has helped boost China's development to become the second biggest economy in the world, while at the same time creating benefit for many other economies internationally. However, the WTO is facing unprecedented criticism, with many members dissatisfied about how disputes are handled, an increasing cause for change. So, what reforms are likely to emerge? What achievements and contributions has China made as part of the WTO? And can the organization continue to be an effective moderator for international economic cooperation? To discuss these issues and more, I'm happy to be joined in the studio by Professor Jiang Gong from the University of International Business, Economics and Max Harborn, the president of the EU Chamber of Commerce in China. That's our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Yang Ray. Welcome to Dialogue, sir. Now, the Foreign Minister of Australia, Mr. Morrison, said recently that actually WTO has failed to live up to the expectations of those who want to sustain, with regard particularly to the reform of this multilateral regime. What's your take?
Well, the WTO is a very complex organization with 164 members, and to get 164 members to agree on where the WTO should go, of course, that is in itself a major challenge.
John?
I think overall the WTO still has been quite effective, at least in one aspect, as I think. That is the issue of dispute resolution. I mean, this dispute resolution mechanism, I think, has been highly successful and effective in resolving many trade disputes, including issues with respect to the United States. So I think, at least from that perspective, at least we have a governance system that has been effective. Of course, there's room for improvement, and the economy has been going on, world trade has been going on, and in many aspects, I think the WTO has been lacking. And that's why we've been talking about this reform. And there's been call for reform from the United States, from EU, and from China as well. So I think we won't. I don't think it's been failing entirely, but I think there's room for improvement.
I agree with you that it has been functioning as a conflict-resolving mechanism. And now when we see that the WTO is threatened, I think the world is waking up to realize that the cost of not having a functioning WTO, it will be higher than the potential small benefits that some countries can get from having special conditions under WTO rules.
17 years on, China has become the second biggest economy. American politicians used to say they welcome a prosperous and a stable economy. That's a blessing for the world economy, until the presidency of Donald Trump, who said enough is enough. Now, what do you think of the fact that China is still denied the full-fledged market economic status by many of those partners who were involved in actually the marathon of China's entry into the WTO?
Well, the view of many countries is that China still isn't the market economy. But I think that's one of the issues. I think the bigger issue is that China benefited a lot from the WTO accession. And China also followed its initial commitments to the WTO. The question now is that China has matured. It's a bigger economy. It's very dominating. And as we say in the chamber, we're now seeing an increasing reform deficit. The deficit between China's reforms and China's growth and maturity. And that gap is now the root cause of the complaints against China in the WTO.
I want to add a few things to this question of yours. When China was successful with WTO 17 years ago, in the accession protocol, there's actually a clause that says that China would be accepted as a market economy, somewhat like this. They will not use what's called a surrogate country methodology to assess China's costs when it comes to trade disputes. And by 16 years after China's accession, China would be automatically admitted to be treated as a country, essentially as a market economy. Now, about this, the United States has a domestic trade law that says that they have a 7-point test to test if China if a country meets the market economy status. This is usually done by the Commerce Department. And for years and after years and after years, the Commerce Department has always come up with this test saying that China hasn't met its definition of market economy. This is the United States stance because they're using a domestic trade law. I think it's 1975 or 1977, I can't remember exactly. And EU side, they're essentially using a legalist approach. They're saying that there's a difference between a market economy versus using the surrogate country methodology. So they come up with a new concept to say that China still needs to apply a sort of a very similar surrogate country methodology when it comes to assessing costs in China. And this issue is only important during anti-dumping cases because they actually use the
anti-dumping and anti-subsidy cases.
Right, yes. Right. They calculate the cost of a good manufactured in this country, but not using the factor cost in this particular country. They're using a surrogate country because it's not a market economy. Usually, I give you one example: the aluminum file in the United States, filing anti-dumping case against China for aluminum foil case, and they're using the cost numbers in South Africa, using the South Africa labor cost, electricity cost, water cost numbers, and especially they pick up the water cost in Johannesburg, which has a drought for 3 years, and including the cost of transporting these aluminum foil to China and then to the United States. And of course the cost is blown up and more than the price is.
But Master, do you think China has been dumping its products? Overcapacity, if you like.
Absolutely, but we need to also understand what happened. China stimulated itself out of the global financial crisis, 2009, 2010. China was planning to reform, but instead it turned the clock backward, and the previous, or the already then recognized structural problems were exacerbated. China built overcapacity in all areas of the economy, and of course good tradesmen took the overcapacity and exported. That was dumping. It was a problem. I do believe that as China reforms, that issue of overcapacity will be reduced. And I think we should go back to where it all started. Why did China join the WTO? Why did Zhu Rongji and Jiang Zemin push for this? Because they wanted to have an external pressure on China to modernize and to reform. We are there again. China does not benefit anymore from having long-lasting special exemptions under the WTO. Instead, China needs to be exposed to further competition and to be forced to reduce subsidies in the economy in order to create a level playing field and a more efficient economy. This will benefit China. So I don't see why we are so stuck with the definition of China being in a market economy or China being this or that.
At the same time, golden days of overseas multinationals seem to be over as well, as we emphasize on the importance of leveling the playing field to give national treatment to all players in the Chinese economy, be they joint venture, public sector, or the private economy. So national treatment, do you think we have done enough to live up to the standard?
This is a golden principle with the WTO, and China, of course, as a WTO member, certainly honors that commitment to providing national treatment status for companies operating in China. But I think this obligation is somewhat mitigated by the term when China was admitted to the WTO, that is under the developing country category. So in that sense, we probably don't have the same obligations compared to those developed countries. And I think the issue of developing versus developed countries is also one of the concerns that the United States is waging against China, saying that we should already move on to the developed country status and have this, commit the same kind of MFN obligation.
By the way, excuse me, let me step in. Do you think generally the United States is dissatisfied with the principle of common but differentiated? You know what I'm talking about. The climate change pact in Paris is actually based on this principle that we are common but differentiated with regard particularly to the differences between developed and developing countries. If you look at history, who has contributed most to the ozone depletion using high carbon fuel, I mean fossil fuel, that has contributed a lot to the rise of sea levels, right?
I think in the case of China and US in the WTO context, it is China that is in a way have been very successful by being part of the WTO. and came in with another logic. China was another economic development model 17 years ago. Now it's moving much more towards being a competitive economy. And if you look at how China acted under the old logic, of course there was a big conflict between China and the US. The more China reforms, that logic will be more similar and the conflict will be reduced.
Let me go back to your initial point on why President Jiang Zemin and Premier Zhu Rongji agreed to proactively join the WTO. One major reason was allegedly that China wants to use the WTO and accession to this multilateral body as a pressure to force the reform of the SOE. But today it seems that the SOE still flawed, still questionable, but making strong inroads into the Chinese economy at the cost of the morale and confidence of the self-employed and the private entrepreneurs. Do you think this time around there's a truth that was called by President Xi Jinping and President Donald Trump on the sidelines of G20 in Argentina would be used to build pressure, we like it or not, in forcing the SOE to comply with the norms and the laws, rules, and so on and so forth that Americans and Europeans prefer to
I think
employ?
The answer is a resounding yes.
Yes.
Absolutely, of course.
Okay.
I think it's a mixed bag for the SOE situation, I think. I mean, we have to keep in mind that we still have a fair amount of SOEs that are competing fiercely in competitive markets, not markets where they have specialized administrative power. I give you some examples. The air conditioning industry here in China is the leading air conditioning company in China by the name of Gree. I don't know if you've heard about this company. Yeah, this is a highly successful SOE. It's the largest air conditioning company in China. It's also the most profitable SOE company in China. It's a competitive.
I believe Madame Dong Mingzhu would be very happy.
Yeah. I'm a big fan of her. I'm a big fan of her. This is just one example. Also, in the companies engaged in the Belt and Road Initiative, these large engineering contracting companies, most of them are SOEs. They don't have any protective power. I mean, they're competing on international markets. It's a highly competitive market. In competition with companies from Turkey, from Europe, and also from South Korea. It's a level playing field.
Yeah, but the thing is that we don't know how much they are supported by various kinds of state support, including subsidies. This is still intransparent, and that is why there is worry around the world that the SOEs are distorting market.
I've been hearing Europeans and Americans complain about the lack of transparency, but would you clarify a little bit what is called the transparency on the performance of SOE, for example?
Well, if you look at the profit and loss statements of Chinese companies, there are lines talking about how much subsidies they receive from the government, so that you can see. But is that the whole picture? What other kinds of support do they receive in forms of cheap capital or free land and other things? Now, of course, we should at the same time recognize that the SOEs have a social burden. They have a rucksack of responsibilities, and the government is saying that we give them support so that they can manage their social responsibilities. Well, I would like to see that instead China reforms its social responsibility system so that it falls outside of the responsibility of the SOEs, and that is a pure government responsibility. Then we would not have to see...
Excuse me, gentlemen, you are watching Dialogue with Matt Haben and Jiang Gong. We are discussing benefits and disadvantages that the entry into WTO has brought to China, whether there's strong need to reform the SOE so that a trade war between the two biggest economies could be averted as a result of the summit meeting on the sidelines of the G20 in Argentina. We'll be back in a short while. Please stay with us. Welcome back, gentlemen. According to a white paper, Mats, published in June by China's State Council Information Office, it mentions that in 2016, China's GDP accounted for 14.8% of the world's total, up by 10.7 percentage points over 2001. Since 2002, China's contribution to global economic growth has approached 30% annually on average. What do you make of the enormous contributions China has made to the rest of the world, despite all accusations on so many charges? So which image is closer to truth?
No, but the truth is, of course, that China is a growing economy and will continue to grow and will become even more dominating. It's already the
But
second.
our contributions to the rest of the world by 30%, do you think this is true?
Yeah, it probably is. Yes, China is one of the growth locomotives of the global economy.
This is absolutely true. This is not just from China. The World Economic Forum at Davos, they issued a report saying that. It's actually printed in their report. 2017 economic growth contribution from China 30%. So absolutely true.
And American consumers benefit so much from our exports, cheap exports, and yet they complain about the huge forex reserves. So whatever we do, we draw fire from the strategic competitor that lists China as an enemy even worse than Russia and ISL. So we are increasingly puzzled.
But perhaps it's not that. It's that as China grows, I think the world is expecting that China more and more adheres to the established global principles of trade and investment. I think that is the key issue. And I think the reform program that China has launched is actually taking China in that direction. So it's a matter of time.
Robert Zelig, a former president of World Bank, has hoped that China could be a major responsible stakeholder. What did he mean?
I think in some ways, I think the European side, as well as some international organization leaders, they probably also are in agreement with some of the acquisitions from Washington, specifically contained in that Section 301 report for so-called distortionary trade practices from China. But certainly they disagree with the means that Donald Trump has been using, in terms of using the trade tariffs to achieve their goal. So I think, they have a point. I think that for certain things, I think there's a room for improvement. And if you look at the acquisitions from Washington, they're mostly talking about intellectual property right protection, forced technology transfer, state subsidy, what else? Market access.
Market access, yes.
These issues basically. And I think some of these issues can be addressed. And some of these issues are already changing. President Li Keqiang emphasized numerous times that we're going to strengthen IPR protection. We're going to strengthen IPR protection. So on these issues, I think the Washington side is preaching the converted. We're already changing. Other issues are subject to negotiation.
Matt, do you think what happens between the United States and China is actually a dogfight vying for digital leadership? Because China is said to be ahead of the United States in the area of 5G and big data, artificial intelligence, and therefore they accuse the Chinese government of pouring so many resources into the research of artificial intelligence. They are afraid that in 20 years they are going to be trailing behind China and they're going to lose the world leadership. Therefore they vow to relaunch the geopolitical rivalry.
Well, from the European Chamber point of view, we of course have no objection to a country having an active industrial policy like China has. The question is, how is it done? Is it very top-down? Is it subsidy-driven? Or is it inclusive and bottom-up? And the way we feel, and I think this is also shared by the Americans, is that if it's too much top-down, too much subsidies, it's creating negative effects, such as overcapacity and other things. Now, when it comes to artificial intelligence, here countries need to invest money in order to keep pace with the development. I think here we see an ongoing competition between US, China, and increasingly also Europe.
Overcapacity also contributes to local debts, so it's also a major problem for the Chinese side. It's not just causing concerns for our European and American partners.
Well, if you're talking about overcapacity in R&D, it's mostly driven in China by local governments, actually. People outside of China need to realize that there's actually intense competition among local governments to attract those talents to start these new businesses that has a great future in artificial intelligence. Back to your question, Yang Rui, I'm actually not convinced that China is leading actually in artificial intelligence and subsidizing or providing.
We are leading artificial intelligence in
terms of
areas
funding.
of talented professionals as well as big data.
Yeah, well, I mean,
they are the envy of the Europeans.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the
Americans.
money put into this, we're probably leading. But in terms of the results generated, I'm not convinced that we're actually leading. I mean, look at the publications in top journals. I'm not convinced that in this field, for example, I'm not convinced that China is indeed leading in this area. And also, I think the subsidizing research is not happening here just in China. The United States government pours a lot of money in the DARPA program. It's a government-sponsored program, and also numerous grants from National Science Foundation. I mean, these money are percolating down to university community. I mean, this is not a state-sponsored research. It's not just a Chinese phenomenon. I mean, it's happening in Europe.
Yeah.
They have national laboratories in the United States, the Argonne Laboratory.
Well, if I come back to the issue of subsidies and top-down innovation, I don't think we have examples that excessive top-down commanded innovation is very efficient. Instead, you need to have a very inclusive situation where perhaps the government sets a clear goal. These are the targets we want to achieve. Then you let society come up with the solutions. And when it comes to the subsidies, I think there is another contradiction here. As we all know, China has now more state-backed sovereign debt than ever before. The question now, should China continue to use that money in efficiently supporting top-down innovation or supporting ailing state-owned enterprises, or should it use that money to build social security systems? I think the question, or the answer to that question, is increasingly easy to answer. Of course, you need to build the security systems.
Well, last month, APEC leaders failed to agree on a final communique. However, the recent G20 summit in Argentina has come to an end with the joint declaration reaching building consensus for a multilateral trade system, fair and sustainable development. Do you agree, Mats, that President Trump has accepted the idea of a multilateralism? At the same time, he repeats himself saying, putting America first, and he chaired. He was a cheerleader for such a big crowd in the United States, particularly in Midwest, talking about bringing jobs back, money back, investment back. So what do you think of the alleged compromise he has made, or do you think he's still insisting on putting America first, whatever, no matter what?
From my point of view, it's very good news that we saw this joint statement from the G20, because it recognizes that the world needs the WTO as a dispute resolving mechanism. We also hope that, of course, the US, when it is encountering disputes with other countries, that if it cannot be resolved through bilateral negotiations, that it also recognizes that it should fall back on the multilateral dispute resolvement mechanism that is the WTO.
I also want to throw in two statistics. The United States government is the country that files most complaints at WTO's dispute resolution process, and it wins 85% of the time. So, you know, the American side is actually really a beneficiary of the WTO, as opposed to be described as a victim. So that's put things into perspective. I think it's very important.
Yeah, you just talked about also how we sometimes neglect how well the WTO actually works when it comes to dispute resolvement. Actually, the major disputes are respected, or the settlements are respected within the WTO.
Yes,
that has to be recognized.
Yes.
Let's take a look at the future of RMB. We haven't opened up the capital account. RMB cannot be converted freely, despite our enormous efforts to list RMB as one of the major reserve currencies in the basket of special drawing rights of IMF. Now, do you think 17 years on, China is better prepared to be the third largest currency, trailing behind the dollar and the euro?
This will happen sooner or later, but probably later, in my view. 17 years is a short time in this perspective.
Yeah, I tend to agree, actually. I think, well, I mean, the path to RMB internationalization, full internationalization, is going to be a phased approach, I think. We're going step by step. And we're also sort of experimenting with different ideas. We have accomplished a couple of things. In addition to the World Bank special drawing rights, we also start to use issue bonds overseas, denominated in RMB, for example. We have a oil trading exchange in Shanghai in oil, for example, using the RMB as a settlement currency. And all these steps, I think, would help eventually internationalize RMB. But it's going to be taking some time.
The rise of RMB somehow depends on the roller coaster, if any, of the petrodollars. After the petrodollars become a controversial issue, what do you think of the strength of the euro?
The strength of a currency is coupled to the trust in that country and that government. And of course, the more Europe becomes an integrated economic entity, the more the trust in the euro will increase. And the same will go for the RMB. The more China gets integrated in the world, the more the world trusts China as a long-term rule-abiding economy, the more the trust in the RMB will increase. But to build that trust for any economy, any country, that takes time. But I think the trend is moving in that direction. However, it will take time.
It takes time to build the credibility of the RMB.
Yeah,
Yeah, that's true.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, do you think in the foreseeable future there's going to be a consensus that China is and has become a developed country, and therefore reform of the WTO is a must, removing all the benefits that China has enjoyed since 17 years ago, John?
Well, I think it's even there's some consensus among scholars here in China that at least we're somewhere between a developed country and developing country. And my attitude, as you know, I've mentioned this a couple of times, that's probably closer to the developed status. GDP per capita is only one of the metric to view a country's developed status. You know, although we are per capita GDP is only about $10,000, and in my opinion is that income is just one metric. I mean, look at the people's asset, for example, right? Look at people's expenditures, you know. Look at the glitzy buildings here in Beijing, right? You know, our government's position is that, well, there are other places here in China that are not highly developed, but United States has the same thing, right?
I mean,
yeah, and well, to
look at value orientation and index of happiness of ordinary folks.
Right.
These are all important measures to look at the glow of China's soft power, which I believe is becoming increasingly important for the international society to build the trust. I'll see you next time. Goodbye.